Hey there, ready for like a deep dive? We're going way back, talking about how the ancient Greeks thought about the soul.
Oh, yeah, this is going to be a good one.
Yeah, we're tracing the evolution of these ideas all the way from, the Iliad and the Odyssey with Homer, all the way through like Plato and the Stoics.
Right. Huge names in philosophy, but, even today, like, their ideas are super relevant. We're still asking the same questions they were wrestling with, like, what makes us who we are? What happens when we die? That whole mind-body thing, still a big one.
Right, absolutely. So I guess to really get into this, we've got to start with the OG, right? I mean, when we're talking about like Homer and the soul, what are we actually talking about? What did the word soul or suche in Greek, what did that even mean back then?
Yeah, so it's not exactly what we probably picture when we hear soul today, right? In Homer, the suche was like super tied to the idea of death. Like it was something a warrior literally risked in battle. You could lose it and that meant you were dead.
So it was almost like their life force, right? That spark that could get snuffed out. But did the soul, like, did it do anything while you were alive? Like, did it shape your personality? Did it affect your choices?
That's where it gets interesting. For Homer, the suche didn't seem to have much to do with who you were as a person, like your character or your actions while you were living. It was more about what happened after you died.
So, like, what did happen to it when you died?
It went to the underworld, but as a shade, like a weaker version of yourself, a ghost, kind of.
Okay, so like a shadowy echo of who you were.
Yeah.
But it didn't really drive your actions or anything when you were, flesh and blood.
Yeah, like take Achilles in the Iliad. He's raging about risking his suche in battle, but he's not talking about his morals or conscience. He's talking about the very essence of himself that could be wiped out.
Right, and we see that over and over, right? Like,
Yeah.
when a hero dies, their suche is described as literally leaving their body, almost like it's a separate thing.
Yeah.
So it sounds like a totally different way of thinking about the soul than we're used to today. It's like all about the afterlife, not the living person.
Exactly. And like that's important to understand, because this basic death soul idea is where it all starts.
Right, it's the foundation. So how do we get from this, like, simple death soul to, the much more complex ideas we see later on?
Well, it was a slow process, like over centuries, and we start to see things changing with some of these pre-Socratic philosophers like Thales. You probably remember him from the early philosophy stuff.
Yeah, vaguely.
Well, he started attributing suche to things like magnets.
Magnets, like the things on our refrigerator.
Yeah. Basically, anything that was capable of movement, he thought had a suture.
That's wild. So he thought magnets had souls.
Yeah, it was a pretty radical idea at the time. But, it shows how the concept was starting to broaden, right? It wasn't just about humans and death anymore. It started being about, like, the principle of life itself.
Right, so anything that was alive or that could move on its own suddenly had a soul.
Exactly. And by the 5th century BC, soul starts to mean basically being alive. It's not just humans. They even thought plants had souls.
So everything is coming alive now.
Yeah, and not just that. The suche starts to be connected with emotions, like courage, even morality. It's becoming more about what makes us tick, not just what happens when we die.
Right, it's becoming more internal.
Totally.
Okay, so like if we're talking about this new understanding of the soul, like where do we see that in, the actual writing of the time? What were people saying about this new suche?
Well, you start to see it everywhere, really. Euripides, the playwright, he talks about souls being strong, enduring. Pindar, the poet, links suche to like courage and resilience. Even Herodotus, the historian, he's using soul to talk about these inner qualities. So it's no longer just this passive thing that floats off when you die. It's actively shaping who you are, how you live your life.
Right, so it's almost like this force within you driving you.
Yeah, it's becoming much more central to the idea of what it means to be human.
Okay, so this is where things start to get really interesting, right? Because now we've got like Plato entering the picture.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really, really interesting. Plato takes this whole soul thing to, like, a whole other level.
So what did he have to say about the soul?
Well, he wrote this dialogue called the Phaedo, and in it, he argues that the soul is not only the essence of a living being, but it's also immortal. Like, it exists independently of the body, and it goes on living after you die.
Wow, okay, that's a pretty big claim. How does he back that up?
Well, one of his big arguments in the Phaedo is what's called the affinity argument.
Affinity argument. What's that all about?
Okay, so the basic idea is that the soul is more like the eternal world of forms than it is like the, physical world we live in.
Okay, just a quick reminder for anyone who needs it. What are the forms again?
Oh, right. So the forms, for Plato, they're like the blueprints of reality. Think of like the perfect version of something. Pure justice, absolute beauty, ultimate truth. Those are forms. And for Plato, the forms were the real deal. This world we live in, it's just a pale imitation.
Right. Okay. So I'm starting to see where this is going. So because the soul, like, seeks truth, it can grasp these abstract, perfect forms. So Plato's saying it must belong to that eternal realm too, right?
Exactly. And because the realm of the forms is eternal and unchanging, the soul, by its very nature, has got to be eternal too.
That's pretty clever, I gotta admit.
Yeah.
But does Plato, like, tell us what the soul's made of in the Phaedo? What's its substance?
Not really. But there is something kind of interesting. He talks about the soul being distinct from the body. And he actually says certain mental states, like basic desires and bodily sensations, those actually belong to the body.
Huh. That's surprising. I mean, we usually think of desires and stuff as coming from our minds, right?
Right. It's almost like he's flipping the script on the mind-body thing. But, to really get into how Plato actually thought about what the soul was made of, we got to turn to another one of his dialogues, the Republic.
Okay, so the Republic.
Yeah, that's where he lays out his famous tripartite theory of the soul.
All right, the tripartite soul.
Yeah, and that's going to get us into like the heart of how Plato understood this whole soul business. So in the Republic, Plato really dives into this idea of the soul having multiple parts. He calls it the tripartite soul.
Tripartite. Okay, so we're talking three parts?
Exactly, three distinct parts: reason, spirit, and appetite.
Okay, so let's unpack that a bit. What do these three parts represent? Like, what are they all about?
Well, think of reason as like the wisest part of your soul, the part that loves knowledge, that wants to understand the world.
So, like, the part of us that's always seeking truth. Makes sense?
Yeah, exactly. It's what allows us to think critically, make judgments, all that good stuff.
Right, okay, that's reason. What about spirit?
So spirit, that's the part of us that's driven by things like honor and courage.
Okay, so like the ambitious part of us.
Yeah,
The part that wants to achieve things.
exactly. It's where our drive comes from, to overcome challenges, stand up for what we believe in.
I'm feeling the spirit just talking about.
Uh-huh.
Okay, so we've got reason, we've got spirit, and then there's appetite. What's that all about?
Well, appetite, as you might guess, is all about pleasure, our basic needs and urges: food, drink, comfort, all that.
So that's the part of us that says yes, please, to that extra slice of pizza.
Exactly. It's the part of us that wants instant gratification.
Okay, so we've got these three characters, these three parts of the soul all battling it out inside of us. So what's Plato's take on how they should be interacting? Like, is it a free-for-all or is there some kind of hierarchy?
Right. So for Plato, a healthy soul is one where reason is in charge. Like it's the charioteer, and spirit and appetite are the horses.
Okay, so reason's got to keep those horses in check.
Exactly. Reason needs to guide spirit's ambition, make sure it's directed at, worthy goals, and it's got to moderate appetite's desires so they don't take over.
It's like a balancing act. I mean, we all know what it's like to be torn between, what we know we should be doing and what we want to be doing. Like when you should be working, but you just want to watch TV.
Yeah.
Is that reason battling it out with appetite?
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And, Plato thought that if we could strengthen our reason, we could live better lives, make choices that align with our higher aspirations.
Right, we wouldn't be slaves to our desires.
Exactly. And that's a really powerful idea, I think.
So we've gone from like Homer's soul, which is basically this shade that goes to the underworld, to this idea of the soul as a life-giving principle. And now we've got Plato's, like this really complex soul with these three parts. What happens next?
Well, we can't talk about Plato without talking about his most famous student, Aristotle.
Right, of course.
And, while he agreed with Plato on some things, he also had his own unique perspective.
So did Aristotle buy into this whole soul as a separate immortal entity thing?
Well, not quite. For Aristotle, the soul was more like the form of a living being, like its essential nature.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following. What do you mean by form here?
Okay, think of it like this. Imagine you have a blueprint for a house. The blueprint itself isn't the house, but it has all the information you need to build it, right?
Right, okay.
So for Aristotle, the soul is like that blueprint. It's what makes a plant, an animal, a human.
So, like, it defines what that living thing is, what it does, how it functions.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so it's not some mysterious, ethereal thing floating around somewhere. It's much more grounded. It's, like, built into the living thing itself.
Yeah, and this is where Aristotle's interest in, like, biology comes in, you know? He saw the soul as responsible for all the functions of a living organism, from growth and reproduction to sensation and movement and even thought.
Wow. So it's a pretty comprehensive view of the soul.
It is. And, for Aristotle, the soul is inseparable from the body. It's what makes the body alive.
Okay, so we've got this really different way of looking at the soul now. So where do we go from here? What happens to these ideas next? So we've come a long way, from Homer's like shadowy underworld soul to Plato's tripartite soul, and then Aristotle's soul is the form of a living being. Where do these ideas go from here?
Well, now we're getting into the Hellenistic period, a really interesting time, lots of new ideas floating around. This is where we see the Stoics and the Epicureans coming in, and they both had pretty unique perspectives on the soul.
Okay, so the Stoics and Epicureans, what were they all about?
Well, one of the big things they had in common was that they both thought the soul was material, like made of physical stuff.
Material, really? That seems like a pretty big departure from what we've been talking about.
Yeah, it was definitely a shift. But even though they both agreed that the soul was made of matter, they had different ideas about, what that matter actually was.
Okay, so what did they think the soul was made of?
Well, the Stoics believed the soul was made of this substance called pneuma.
Pneuma, what's that?
It was like this fiery, breath-like substance that they thought was everywhere, like permeating the whole cosmos.
Fiery breath, huh?
Kidding.
Interesting. So what did this pneuma have to do with the soul?
Well, for the Stoics, pneuma was the force that animated all living things. It was like a divine fire or reason flowing through the universe, connecting everything, giving it life.
So it's like the breath of the cosmos.
Yeah, exactly. And because they thought pneuma was material, they thought the soul was material too, subject to the same laws of nature as everything else.
Okay, that makes sense. So what about the Epicureans? What did they think this material soul was made of?
Well, they were atomists, so they thought that everything, including the soul, was made up of these tiny indivisible particles called atoms.
Right, atoms, okay.
Yeah, and they thought there were like special soul atoms, really fine ones that were responsible for sensation, thought, all the things we associate with the mind.
Interesting. So both the Stoics and Epicureans were materialists, but they had different ideas about what that, material soul was made of. Did they have any other points of agreement when it came to the soul?
Yeah, they both really emphasized the mind and how it worked. For the Stoics, it was all about reason and logic. They believed the mind was this unified rational force and that, the key to living a good life was to live in accordance with reason.
Right, so living rationally. What are the Epicureans? What was their take on the mind?
They had a bit more of a complex view, I'd say. They actually divided the soul into two parts,
Yeah.
the rational and the non-rational.
Okay, two parts, interesting. So what did each part do?
The rational part was responsible for thinking and making decisions, while the non-rational part was in charge of, our emotions and desires.
That sounds kind of similar to Plato's tripartite soul, with those different parts competing for control.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels there. But for the Epicureans, it wasn't about reason always being in charge. For them, happiness was about achieving this state of tranquility, free from pain and disturbance by, really understanding and managing our desires.
Okay, so they were all about finding that inner peace.
Yeah, exactly. And that meant understanding your own mind, how it works.
Makes sense. Okay, so we covered so much ground, from Homer all the way to the Stoics and Epicureans. It's really amazing to see how much these ideas about the soul evolved over time.
Yeah, and it shows how much people were thinking about these big questions, even back then. What does it mean to be human? What happens after we die?
Exactly. And it's really fascinating to me. It's that, these questions haven't gone away. We're still asking them today.
Oh, absolutely. We're still trying to figure out what this whole soul thing is all about.
Yeah. And maybe we'll never have all the answers, but it's the journey, right? It's the exploration of these ideas that's so enriching.
Totally. And I think, even the theories that seem kind of strange to us now, they can still teach us something. They challenge us to think differently, to question our assumptions.
Right, to keep searching for those deeper truths. So to our listeners, we leave you with this. Which of these ancient theories resonates with you most? What do you think the soul is?
Yeah, and what does it mean for how you live your life? Let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the ancient theories of the soul. It's been quite a journey, right?
It really has. And hopefully, it's giving you some food for thought.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.